Tonight, I want you to close your eyes and ask yourself one question. Just one. What happens when you die? You don't have to answer it, you don't have to think too hard. Just let the question sit with you the way it must have sat with every human being who has ever lived. Because here is something remarkable, something historians rarely say out loud. Thousands of years ago, in the scorching deserts of Egypt, a priest carefully wrapped a body in white linen and whispered prayers into the ears of the dead. He believed, truly, completely believed, that the soul needed help finding its way. That without his words, without his rituals, without those careful knots in the cloth, the dead person would be lost. Forever. At the same time, thousands of miles to the north, in the frozen longhouses of Scandinavia, a Viking warrior was being laid into a wooden ship. His weapons were placed beside him, his horse was sacrificed, his people stood in silence and watched the flames rise into a black winter sky. They believed just as completely that he was not gone, he was sailing somewhere. And in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, the land between two great rivers, the oldest civilization we have ever found, a scribe was pressing words into wet clay. Words meant for the dead, instructions, warnings. A kind of map for a journey no living person had ever returned from. Three civilizations, three worlds apart. No shared language, no shared roads, no knowledge of each other's existence. And yet all three feared the exact same thing. Not death itself. What came after? This is the story that has never been told in one place. Not in any classroom, not in any documentary you've half-watched on a sleepless night. Tonight, we are going to travel across four ancient worlds: Egypt, Rome, the Viking North, and the oldest civilization ever discovered, and we are going to sit quietly with the dead. We are going to listen to what they feared. And somewhere in that fear, you will recognize something. Something that sounds very familiar. Because the truth is, we have not changed as much as we like to think. Close your eyes, let your body grow heavy. Let the darkness around you become something softer, something older. We are going back. Way, way back. To a time before electric light, before clocks, before any of the noise that fills your waking hours. Imagine a world where night was truly dark, not city dark, not the faint glow of a streetlight through a curtain, but absolute, unbroken, ancient darkness. In that darkness, people looked up. They looked at the stars the way we look at our phones, searching for information, searching for meaning, searching for some signal that the universe was aware of them, that they mattered, that this life was not simply a brief flickering and then nothing. And the question they carried, the one they could never set down, the one they whispered to their priests and their gods and their dying mothers, was this: where do we go? Tonight we are going to answer that question, 4 times in 4 very different voices. But before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the people in this story. They were not primitive. They were not simply frightened children who invented fairy tales to make themselves feel better. These were brilliant minds, architects who designed buildings that modern engineers still study with quiet amazement, philosophers who mapped the invisible parts of the human soul with the same precision a surgeon maps the body, sailors who crossed unknown oceans using nothing but wind and stars and an understanding of the world that took centuries to develop. And all of them, every single one of them, took the afterlife more seriously than almost anything else in life. The Egyptian pharaoh spent more years and more gold building his tomb than he spent on any palace, any army, any conquest. The Viking warrior's deepest preparation was never for the next battle. It was for the one that came after death. In Rome, entire government funds were dedicated to rituals for the dead, because Romans believed without any doubt that an unhappy soul could return, and an unhappy soul was far more dangerous than any living enemy. And in Mesopotamia, the oldest civilization we have ever uncovered, the afterlife was not a reward. It was not paradise, it was not rest. It was something darker than that. Something that made them lie awake at night. Something that, if I told you right now, might do the same to you. But here is the thing that silences historians when they first encounter it. The detail that should not exist. Across all 4 of these civilizations, separated by centuries, by deserts, by entire oceans of open water, there is one image they all share. One vision carved into stone, painted onto tomb walls, pressed into clay, written on the inside of coffin lids. A river. Every single one of them believed there was a river between the living world and the dead one. A crossing. A moment, one final, irreversible moment, where the soul stands at the edge of everything familiar and looks out across dark, still water. Different names, different gods waiting on the far shore, different rules for who was allowed to cross. But the same river. Every time. We will walk the banks of that river tonight, through four different ancient worlds in four different kinds of darkness. And by the time this story ends and silence gathers around you like a soft weight, you may find yourself thinking about that river in a way you did not expect. Stay with me. We are only just beginning. Let us begin with the world as it was. Not the world you know, not the world of highways and grocery stores and the quiet hum of a refrigerator in the next room. The world we are entering tonight had none of that. It had no buffer between a human being and the raw, indifferent darkness of the universe. It had only fire. A single flame, an oil lamp, a torch, a campfire standing between a person and the absolute night. And in that thin circle of light, people thought. They thought the way we no longer allow ourselves to think, slowly, deeply, without distraction. For hours, sometimes for entire lifetimes, the greatest minds in the ancient world sat with one question and turned it over like a stone, looking at every side, examining every shadow it cast. What happens when the fire goes out? Not the lamp, the one inside you. Let us visit the first world. Oh, Egypt. Close your eyes and go there now. It is 3,000 years before you were born. The sun has set over the Nile. The great river, wide, dark, impossibly calm, reflects a sky so full of stars it looks like the surface of another world. The air smells of warm mud, of burning cedar oil, of dried flowers left as offerings on stone altars. The city is quiet, but it is never quite silent. There is always a priest somewhere in the darkness chanting. In Egypt, the dead were not separate from the living. They were neighbors. They lived in the tombs at the edge of the city, and the living visited them, left them food, spoke to them through small stone windows built into the tomb walls, openings just large enough to pass a bowl of grain, a cup of beer, a word of news from the family they had left behind. The Egyptians did not grieve their dead the way we do. They did not say goodbye. They said, "See you later, we will take care of you, do not wander." Because wandering, a soul without care, without food, without someone to speak its name, was the thing they feared most. In Egypt, to be forgotten was to die a second time, and the second death was permanent. That is why the pharaohs carved their names on every surface of every monument they ever built. Not vanity, fear. If your name survived, you survived. If no one remembered you, you were gone. Forever. Now let us leave Egypt behind and move north and west. We are in Rome now. A different kind of darkness. Rome at night was loud in a way Egypt was not. The streets were narrow and steep, packed with the sounds of cartwheels on stone, of arguments in crowded apartments stacked 4 and 5 floors high, of dogs and laughter and someone somewhere always crying. The Romans were a passionate people. They felt everything loudly. But below all of that noise, there was a fear they rarely spoke about in daylight. The fear of the dead who had not been properly cared for. In Rome, a person who died without a funeral was dangerous, not sad, not pitiable. Dangerous. Their spirit, called a larva or a lemur in its most threatening form, would drift back from the underworld and return to the house where it had lived. It would move through the rooms at night. It would stand at the foot of beds. It would press against the chests of sleeping children. The Romans were so afraid of this that they built an entire calendar around managing their dead. In May, there was a festival called the Lemuria, 3 nights when the head of every Roman household would rise at midnight, walk barefoot through his home, and throw black beans over his shoulder into the darkness behind him. 9 times. Without looking back. Because looking back, acknowledging the spirit directly, would invite it in. The beans were a bribe, an offering, a way of saying, "Here, take these and leave us alone." The father of a family, the most powerful man in his home, on his knees in the dark, throwing beans at something he could not see. That is how seriously Rome took its dead. Now we go further north. Much further. The air changes, you feel it before you see anything. Cold comes first, a deep, bone-settling cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the quality of the darkness in northern places. In Scandinavia, in winter, the night lasts 18 hours. 18 hours of darkness in which a person has nothing to do but sit beside a fire and think. The Vikings were not the brutal, mindless raiders that most people imagine. They were poets. They were navigators of extraordinary precision. They were people who had built an entire theology, a complete, intricate, staggeringly detailed map of the universe, out of long, dark nights and the questions those nights produced. Their universe had 9 worlds. Not one. 9 distinct realms of existence, some for gods, some for giants, one for humans, and several for the dead. Different kinds of dead. Different destinations depending on how you lived, how you died, and whether anyone told the story of your death correctly afterward. Because for the Vikings, the story mattered as much as the life. A death without a witness was a death half finished. And finally, we go to the oldest place of all, Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in what is now modern Iraq. The civilization that invented writing. The civilization that built the first cities. The civilization that, as far as we can tell from every piece of evidence we have ever uncovered, was the first place on Earth where human beings sat down together and decided to build something that would last. They lasted 4,000 years. They invented laws, they invented mathematics, they invented the concept of a work week, they invented beer. And they invented, in the most detailed and precise terms of any ancient culture we have found, a description of what waited for you after death. It was not a comforting description. The Mesopotamians called their underworld Kur, or sometimes Urkala after the queen who ruled it. And unlike the paradise promised by other cultures, unlike the feasting halls of the Viking dead, unlike the eternal sunshine of the Egyptian afterlife, Kur was gray. Flat, still, silent. A place where the dead ate dust and clay. Where they wore feathers like birds and never saw light. Where everyone went, regardless of how well or how badly they had lived. The good and the wicked, the king and the slave, the mother and the soldier. All of them in the same gray place, eating dust, waiting. For nothing. It is perhaps the most honest afterlife any civilization has ever imagined, and it is perhaps the most terrifying. So here we are. 4 worlds, 4 fires burning against 4 different darknesses. Egypt where your soul could live forever, but only if someone remembered your name. Rome where the dead came back and they were not always friendly. The Viking North where there were 9 worlds waiting, and which one received you depended entirely on the story someone else told about your life. And Mesopotamia, the oldest voice in this conversation, saying quietly from 4,000 years ago, everyone ends up in the same gray place. Everyone. 4 answers to the same question. And none of them, you will notice, said nothing. Not one ancient civilization looked at death and said, there is nothing on the other side. They all saw something. They all feared something. And the closer we look at what each of them feared, the more we will understand not just who they were, but who we are. Because the stories are about to get much darker. Stay with me. History has a way of making the past feel like a painting. Still flat distant. We look at ancient civilizations the way we look at museum exhibits through glass, with a quiet, respectful silence as if the people inside were never really alive. As if they were always stone, always monuments, always the grand, sweeping version of themselves that textbooks describe. But they were not. They were people. They had mornings they did not want to face. They had relationships that confused them. They had nights, long, dark, ancient nights, where they lay on their backs and stared at the ceiling and thought about death in the same ordinary, helpless way that you sometimes do. Tonight, I want you to meet four of them. Not kings, not gods, not the famous names carved on the walls. The ones just below that, the ones who kept the world running, the ones whose fears were the most honest because they had no power to pretend otherwise. Her name was Merit. We do not know her exact name, of course. Names like hers were rarely carved into stone, but we know she existed because of what she left behind. We know her through the tools found in her workroom, through the recipes pressed into papyrus, through the careful notes of a profession that required more precision than almost any other in the ancient world. Merit was a female embalmer in ancient Egypt. Yes, they existed. In fact, some of the most skilled embalmers in Egyptian history were women, and they carried a weight that most people today cannot fully imagine. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen over the Nile, Merritt walked to work through streets that smelled of river mud and fresh bread. She passed families beginning their days, children chasing dogs, old men arguing over grain prices, women carrying water in clay jars balanced on their heads, ordinary, alive. And then she entered her workroom, and for the next 10 hours she cared for the dead. The embalming process took 70 days. 70 days of precise, careful, deeply ritualized work because the Egyptians believed that every step mattered. Every wrong move, every careless cut, every missed prayer could damage the soul's chance of reaching the afterlife safely. Imagine carrying that responsibility every day. Merit was not morbid about her work. The Egyptians were not morbid people. To them, preparing a body was an act of love, the last and most important thing you could do for another human being. She washed each person carefully. She wrapped each layer of linen with prayers whispered under her breath, the same words her mother had taught her, the same words her mother's mother had spoken in this same room. But at night, when she went home to her small house near the river, she did something that no one outside her family knew about. She checked her own name. On a small piece of limestone hidden beneath a loose floor tile, she had carved her name herself, carefully, deeply, not with the skill of a professional stonecutter, but with the fierce, private determination of a woman who understood better than almost anyone what happened when a name was forgotten. She was terrified of the second death, the one no embalmer could prevent. She checked her name every night before sleep, just to make sure it was still there. Now meet Marcus. He was a Roman soldier, 34 years old, stationed in what is now northern England, far from Rome, far from home, standing on a stone wall at the edge of the known world in the cold gray rain. Marcus was not a philosopher. He was not educated in the way Roman senators were educated. He could read barely, and he wrote home to his mother in short, simple sentences that historians have since found on scraps of thin wood buried near Hadrian's Wall. Those letters still exist. In one of them, he asks his mother to send warm socks. He mentions the rain. He says the men in his unit are getting sick. In another, written later, the handwriting slightly different, slightly more careful. As if he thought harder about each word, he asks her something else. He asks her to make sure the offerings are left at the family shrine. Not for him, not for good luck in battle. For his father, who had been dead for 11 years. Because Marcus had not been home in 4 years, and he was worried that his father's spirit, without proper offerings, without someone speaking his name, might be suffering somewhere in the underworld. He was 34 years old. He had survived battles, brutal winters, infections that killed the men sleeping beside him. He was, by any measure, a hard and practical man. And he lay awake at night worrying about his dead father's comfort. That is what Rome did to a person. That is what Rome believed, all the way down to its soldiers shivering in the rain at the edge of the world. The dead needed you, and if you failed them, they noticed. Further north, in a small coastal settlement in what is now Norway, a woman named Astrid was doing something her community considered deeply important. She was memorizing a death. Astrid was what her people called a skald, a keeper of stories. Not a poet for entertainment, though her words were beautiful. A skald was something more serious than that. She was responsible for preserving the stories of the dead, speaking them aloud again and again at every gathering, at every meal, at every ceremony, so that the people who had died were never forgotten. Because in Viking belief, you lived as long as someone told your story. Astrid had memorized 47 deaths. 47 complete life stories held entirely in her memory, recited at the appropriate moments to keep 47 souls alive in whatever realm they now occupied. She took this work with a seriousness that bordered on sacred. She ate carefully so her mind stayed sharp. She slept beside the fire so the cold would not disturb her rest. She had refused to marry twice, not because she did not want a family, but because she could not afford the distraction. 47 people were depending on her memory, and there was one among them that she recited more carefully than any other. Her son, who had died at 7 years old from a fever 4 winters ago. His story was short, a child's story always is, but she had expanded it carefully, respectfully, filling in the details of who he might have become, the man she had seen forming inside the boy. She recited it every night before sleep. His name first. Always his name first. And finally, in the oldest city in this story, a scribe named Ernama sat at his work table long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. He was copying a text he had copied many times before, a text so old that even in his times, 3,000 years before the birth of Rome, it was considered ancient. It was called The Descent of Inanna, the story of a goddess who traveled into the underworld, who passed through 7 gates, removing a piece of her power at each one, until she arrived in the land of the dead with nothing. Ernama did not copy this text because he was assigned to. He copied it because it frightened him, and he had learned over many years that the only way to manage a fear was to hold it in your hands, to look at it directly. He believed that the underworld was waiting for him, waiting for everyone, that the dust and the silence and the gray stillness were coming for him just as surely as they came for the king, for the temple priestess, for the beggar outside the city wall. He was not bitter about this. He was not broken by it. He simply wanted to understand it as completely as he could before he arrived. He kept writing until the lamp ran low. Then he stopped, covered the tablet carefully, and went to bed. In the morning, he would begin again. Because some questions, Ernama understood, deserve a lifetime of attention. And somewhere in the depth of this night, you may be beginning to understand that too. But wait, there is something even stranger still to come. Because all 4 of these people, Merritt, Marcus, Astrid, Ernama, shared one fear that none of them ever spoke out loud. One fear that connects them to each other. And to you. That fear has a name. It does not translate perfectly into modern English. Each civilization had its own word for it, but the feeling underneath the word, the raw, human, sleepless feeling, is identical across all 4. It is the fear of an unfinished crossing. Think of it this way. Every ancient civilization we have discussed tonight, Egypt, Rome, the Viking North, Mesopotamia, believed that death was not an ending. It was a transition, a movement from one place to another. And like all journeys, it required preparation. It required someone on the living side to do their part. If they did not, if no one performed the rituals, spoke the prayers, left the offerings, told the story, then the soul did not arrive. It simply drifted, caught between the world of the living and whatever waited on the other side, not alive, not dead, not at rest. Just waiting for someone to remember. Now here is where history becomes something stranger than any story you have ever been told. When archaeologists began comparing the afterlife beliefs of ancient Egypt with those of ancient Mesopotamia in the early 20th century, they expected to find differences. Major fundamental differences. These were 2 entirely separate civilizations, different languages, different gods, different geography, different food, different architecture, different everything. What they found instead made several of them stop working and sit very quietly for a while. The similarities were not superficial, they were structural. Both civilizations believed in a realm of the dead that existed beneath the earth, reached by traveling downward through layers of reality. Both believed the soul had to pass through a series of gates or checkpoints, and at each one something was required. A password, a prayer, a piece of the self surrendered. Both believed a divine judge waited at the end of this journey. And both, most remarkably of all, believed there was a ferryman, a figure who transported souls across water. In Egypt, it was a boatman who crossed the sacred lake within the realm of the dead. In Mesopotamia, his name was Urshanabi, and he carried souls across the waters of death in a vessel that could only be steered in one very specific, very carefully described way. Now travel north to Greece, which inherited much of its mythology from even older Mediterranean and Near Eastern sources, and you find Charon, the ferryman of the river Styx. A hooded figure, silent, extending a hand for the coin placed on the tongue of the dead. The coin. The Greeks made sure to bury their dead with a coin in the mouth or on the eyes. Not a symbol, not a gesture, a literal payment for a literal boat on a literal river. Travel further north to Scandinavia, and the Vikings sent their greatest warriors to sea on burning ships because they believed death itself was a sea voyage, a crossing of dark water toward a shore the living could not see. Four civilizations, four ferrymen, one river. But wait, there is something even stranger about this. Something that historians rarely include in the textbooks, because it sits at the uncomfortable edge between history and something that feels much older. The river has a direction. In every single one of these traditions, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, Norse, the river of the dead flows in the same direction. West, always west. The land of the dead in almost every ancient culture we have studied lies to the west, the direction of the setting sun, the direction where light goes to die each evening and crucially returns from each morning. The Egyptians called it the Jewet, the western realm beneath the earth where the sun traveled through the night before rising again in the east. To be buried on the west bank of the Nile was considered a great honor. Merit, the embalmer you met earlier, always positioned the heads of her bodies facing west. Always. The Norse believed the realm of hell not hell in the Christian sense, but simply the place where ordinary people went after death lay down into the northwest, the direction the sun never quite reached in winter. The Romans made their offering bowls face west during evening rituals for the dead. These people never met, they never compared notes. They had no shared philosophy, no common ancestor religion that we can definitively trace. And yet they all looked west when they thought about where the dead had gone. There is a question inside that fact that no historian has fully answered. We will let it sit with you for a moment. Now let us look more closely at what each civilization feared most within their afterlife belief. Because fear, as it turns out, tells you more about a civilization than any monument ever built. The Egyptians feared the weighing of the heart. Every soul, upon arriving in the afterlife, faced a ceremony that no amount of wealth or power or royal blood could change the outcome of. The heart, the seat of the soul, the keeper of every deed ever done, was removed and placed on one side of a golden scale. On the other side sat a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truce. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if a life had been filled with cruelty, with dishonesty, with the small and large failures of character, the scale tipped. And waiting beside the scale, patient and inevitable, was a creature the Egyptians called Ammit. Part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. She ate the hearts that failed. And a heart that was eaten by Amit did not go to a lesser afterlife or face punishment or begin again. It simply ceased to exist. The obliteration of the self, not death. Annihilation. That was what the Egyptians feared most. Not dying badly, not being forgotten even. Being found insufficient. The Romans feared something quieter. They feared the mouth. In Roman belief, when a person died, the mouth had to be closed immediately, a coin placed on the tongue, because the mouth was the door through which the soul departed, and if it was left open, if no one was there to close it in time, something else might enter. Something that had been waiting. The Romans had a word for the hours immediately after death, the hora mortis, the hour of dying, and it was considered the most dangerous period a household could experience. Not because of grief, because of the invisible things that moved through houses where the threshold between the living and the dead had just been torn open. Every lamp was lit, every door was closed, every member of the family stayed awake. Not to mourn, to guard. What they were guarding against, the Romans never described precisely. Some things they understood were better left without names. Because naming a thing in the ancient world was the same as inviting it closer. And there are some doors, even tonight, that are better left unopened. But we are going to open them anyway. Because the darkest part of this story is still ahead. And you will want to know what is on the other side. Let us begin with the Vikings. Because of all the afterlife beliefs we have encountered tonight, theirs is perhaps the most misunderstood and the most brutal in its honesty. Most people, when they think of Viking death, think of Valhalla, the great hall, the golden roof made of shields. The endless feasting and fighting, the beautiful women called Valkyries carrying fallen warriors through the sky, the promise of a warrior's paradise waiting on the other side of a good death. It is a magnificent image. And it applied to almost no one. Valhalla was not for everyone. It was not even for most warriors. It was reserved for a very specific kind of dead soldiers who had fallen in battle, chosen personally by the Valkyries, selected from the bodies on the field before the blood had dried. A small number, a chosen few. The rest, the farmers, the mothers, the craftsmen, the sailors who drowned at sea, the children who never grew old enough to hold a weapon, the warriors who survived their battles and died peacefully in their beds, went somewhere else entirely. They went to hell, and hell was not a place of punishment. That is a Christian reimagining of the name that came later. In the original Norse belief, hell was simply gray, cold. A vast underground realm ruled by a being of the same name, a goddess who was, by all accounts, neither cruel nor kind, simply indifferent. Half her face was living flesh. Half was the blue-white color of a corpse. She ruled in silence. Her hall was called Sleekold. Her table was called Hunger. Her knife was called Famine. Her bed was called Sickbed. Her curtains were named Misfortune. The Vikings named everything, including the furniture of death. And the souls who arrived in Hell's realm did not suffer exactly. They simply existed. A pale, diminished version of their living selves moving slowly through a cold, gray world that felt like a memory of life rather than life itself. That was the fate of the ordinary dead, not paradise, not punishment, just a slow, quiet fatting. But there was a third place. Below hell, deeper than the cold gray halls, deeper than the underground rivers, deeper than any of the 9 worlds except the very last and lowest. Niflheim. The world of primordial ice and darkness, the place where not even the dead wanted to go. This was not for ordinary people. This was reserved for those who had lived with particular dishonor, murderers of their own kin. Oathbreakers, men who had made a solemn promise and broken it. In Viking society, there was no greater sin than betraying your word. Your oath was the architecture of your identity. Without it, you were not a person. You were a shape wearing human skin. The souls of oathbreakers were sent to Niflheim, where a great serpent named Nithurgur gnawed at the roots of the world tree and fed on the bodies of the dishonored dead. Not their souls, their bodies, because in Niflheim you felt everything. Forever. The Vikings did not invent this place to frighten children. They built it into the foundation of their entire moral world because they understood something that modern societies often forget, that the way a civilization treats its promises is the way it treats its people. Break enough oaths, and the world tree itself begins to crack. Nithurgur was not a monster. He was a consequence. Now let us cross the world entirely. Back to Mesopotamia, back to the oldest voice in this conversation. Because if the Vikings built the most structured afterlife, Mesopotamia built the most frightening. The story of Inanna's descent into the underworld is the oldest written story about death that humanity has ever found. It is 4,000 years old, and it begins with a goddess, one of the most powerful in the Mesopotamian pantheon, deciding to visit the realm of the dead. Not because she has to, because she chooses to. She descends through 7 gates. At each gate, a guardian stops her and demands something. At the first gate, her crown is taken. At the second, her earrings. At the third, her necklace. Her breastplate at the fourth. Her bracelet at the fifth. At the sixth, they take the measuring rod she carries, her symbol of power and judgment. And at the 7th gate, the last piece of clothing she wears is stripped away. She arrives in the underworld naked, stripped of every symbol of who she was. This was not accidental. The Mesopotamians were precise people. They meant this exactly. They were saying, in death, none of the things that defined you in life come with you, not your title, not your beauty, not your power, not even your clothing. You arrive as the most basic possible version of yourself. Just a soul, standing in the dust. What happened to Inanna in the underworld is the part that Nama, the scribe, copied over and over again, long after midnight by lamplight. The queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, Inanna's own sister, killed her. Hung her body on a hook, like a piece of meat, and left her there. 3 days and 3 nights passed in the world above. Plants stopped growing. Animals stopped reproducing. The entire living world began to slow and dim because the goddess of life and love was dead on a hook in the world below. Eventually she was rescued, eventually she returned. But not without a price. The law of Kerr was absolute. No one left the underworld without sending someone else in their place. Inanna had to choose who would take her spot. She chose her husband. The Mesopotamians were not sentimental about death. They were honest, and their honesty produced something that the other civilizations did not quite put into words so plainly. The underworld does not care about you. It is not waiting to reward your goodness or punish your evil. It is simply a place, a permanent, unavoidable, completely indifferent place. The only thing more frightening than a cruel afterlife is one that doesn't notice you at all. Now bring all 4 civilizations back together in your mind. Egypt, where a creature waited beside a golden scale to devour the hearts of the insufficient. Rome, where the improperly buried dead returned in the night and stood at the foot of your bed, pressing down on your chest while you slept. The Viking North, where an ordinary death meant an eternity of slow, cold fatting, and a dishonorable death meant something far worse far below. Mesopotamia, where even the most powerful goddess in existence was hung on a hook in the dark and left there for 3 days. What do these 4 fears have in common? Think about it for a moment. Not the details, the shape underneath. In every single case, the thing they feared was not pain, it was not fire, it was not darkness or cold or monsters. It was insignificance. Being found wanting on the scale, being forgotten by the living, fatting slowly into gray, arriving stripped of everything, standing in dust unnoticed. Every ancient civilization, in its own language with its own gods, was afraid of the same thing. That their life would not have been enough. That after everything, the work, the love, the years of waking up and trying, they would stand somewhere on the other side of death, and whatever was waiting there would look at them and find them small. That fear is 4,000 years old, and it has not aged a single day. Keep listening. Because there is one more secret buried in all of this, something so quietly hidden in the historical record that most scholars walk right past it. A detail so strange, so unexpectedly human, that when you hear it, you will understand these ancient people in a way no textbook has ever allowed you to. We are almost there. Here is the detail that most people never hear. In the ruins of ancient Egypt, archaeologists have found letters, not letters written by the living to each other. Letters written by the living to the dead, papyrus and pottery and stone, carefully inscribed with messages addressed to people who had been gone for years, sometimes decades. A widow writing to her dead husband, asking him to intervene in a legal dispute on her behalf. A son writing to his father, complaining about a brother who had cheated him out of his inheritance. A mother writing to a daughter lost in childbirth, asking her to stop sending bad dreams. They believed the dead could hear them, not as a comforting metaphor, as a practical fact. The dead were still there, they still had influence. They could still act on behalf of the people they loved or harm those they had reason to resent. And so the living wrote to them, left the letters at the tomb, and waited. Sometimes, when things improved, when the lawsuit was won, when the difficult brother suddenly relented, when the bad dreams stopped, they wrote again to say thank you. When researchers first found these letters, some of them laughed, not cruelly. The way you laugh when something surprises you so completely that your body doesn't know what else to do. Because these letters sound exactly like something a person might write today, the frustration is the same. The grief underneath the practical request is the same. The strange, stubborn refusal to accept that the person you love is simply gone, the insistence that they are somewhere, still reachable, still listening, that is the same. 4,000 years between us. And the letter sounds like something you might find in your own family's drawer. Most people don't know this about ancient Egypt. The textbooks give you pharaohs and pyramids and golden masks. They do not give you the widow sitting alone at night, pressing a reed into wet clay, writing to her dead husband about a problem with the grain storage. They do not give you her handwriting, which is slightly uneven on the left side. The way handwriting sometimes is when someone is trying not to cry while they write. But that evidence exists, and it changes everything about how we understand these people. Now here is something equally extraordinary about ancient Rome that almost no one outside of classical studies knows. The Romans did not believe in a single soul. They believed each person contained three separate spiritual components, each of which had a different fate after death. The first was the anima, the breath, the life force, the thing that simply ceased when the body stopped functioning. The second was the manes, the divine spirit of the dead, which became, after proper burial and mourning rituals, a protective ancestor. The manes of well-honored dead were considered guardian spirits of the household. Romans prayed to them the way others pray to saints. But the third is the one that kept Romans awake at night. The third was called the umbra, the shadow. The umbra was the part of a person that lingered near the place of death. Not in the underworld, not in the household shrine, but right there, in the room, at the crossroads where an accident had happened, in the water where a person had drowned. The umbra did not go anywhere. It simply stayed. And if it had unfinished business, if it had died violently or been betrayed or left with words unsaid, it became something that Romans feared deeply enough to build entire religious festivals around managing. There are accounts, recorded by Roman writers with the same calm matter-of-factness they used to record military campaigns and trade agreements, of houses that could not be sold because the umbra of a previous owner still walked through the rooms at night. One such account describes a philosopher who rented a house cheaply because no one else would live there. The umbra appeared each night, an old man, thin, rattling chains. The philosopher, undisturbed, followed the apparition to a spot in the courtyard, marked it, and went back to sleep. The next morning, he reported it to the city authorities. They dug. They found a body improperly buried, still bound in chains. They gave it a proper funeral. The house was never disturbed again. This account is almost 2,000 years old. It reads like a story someone might tell tonight, sitting around a fire in a voice exactly like this one. Now let us return to the Vikings for one final hidden truth that almost no popular account of Norse mythology ever mentions. The Vikings believed that the story of your death could be changed. Not your death itself, but the story of it. And the story was what determined where your soul went. If a warrior died in battle but fell in a way that looked unglamorous, collapsed from exhaustion before the final blow, or died from a wound to the back that suggested retreat, the skald, the keeper of stories, had both the right and the duty to reframe the account, not to lie exactly, but to find the truth inside the chaos of battle and present it in a way that honored the person's actual courage, even if the physical facts were complicated. The story was not falsification. It was advocacy. You remember Astrid, who kept the stories of 47 dead, who recited her son's story every night before sleep, carefully expanded to include the man she had seen forming inside the boy. She was not simply grieving. She was, by the logic of her entire civilization, actively protecting him. Every recitation was an argument made on his behalf to whatever forces organized the dead. He was here, he mattered, his story is worth telling, let him through. This is what it meant to be remembered in the Viking world. It was not sentiment. It was survival. And Mesopotamia. One final hidden truth from the oldest civilization at this table. The Mesopotamians had a problem that their theology created and their pragmatism solved. The problem was this: if the soul required living relatives to perform the proper death rituals, to leave food and water at the grave, to speak the name of the dead, to maintain the connection between the living world and Kur, then what happened to people who had no family? What happened to the childless, the travelers who died far from home, the slaves who had been separated from every person who knew their name? The Mesopotamians thought about this very carefully. And they invented a solution that is so simple, so generous, and so unexpectedly modern that it is genuinely startling to find it 4,000 years old. You could adopt a friend, formally, legally, with contracts pressed into clay and witnessed by the appropriate authorities. A person facing death without family could enter into a ritual adoption with a trusted friend, who would then take on all the obligations of a biological child, performing the offerings, speaking the name, maintaining the grave. In exchange, the friend inherited whatever the dying person left behind. It was a contract between the living and the dead, enforced by the social structures of an entire civilization. Because the Mesopotamians understood something so fundamentally human that it cuts straight through 4,000 years and lands quietly in this moment, in this darkness, while you are lying still and listening. No one should have to cross that river alone. Not the goddess, not the slave, not the old philosopher following an umbra through a courtyard, not the soldier writing home about his father from a rainy wall at the edge of the world, not the embalmer checking her own name on a stone tile in the dark. Not any of them. And not you. The ancient world, for all its strangeness and distance, understood this one thing with perfect clarity. The crossing is easier when someone remembers you. When someone knows your name. When someone, somewhere on the shore you left behind, is still telling your story. That is not superstition. That is not myths. That is the oldest human truth we have ever found. And we are almost at the end of this river now. The far shore is just ahead. We have traveled a long way tonight across deserts and frozen plains, through narrow Roman streets and underground Mesopotamian halls, along the banks of a river that has no name in any single language but exists somehow in all of them. It is time to begin finding our way back, not back to those ancient worlds. We cannot go back there. Those fires have been out for thousands of years, and the people who sat beside them are long past any crossing we can imagine back to this moment, this room. This darkness, this particular night that belongs only to you. But before we arrive there completely, I want to show you something, a pattern. It has been running quietly beneath this entire story, like a current beneath dark water, and now that we are near the end, it is time to bring it to the surface. Every civilization we visited tonight built their afterlife beliefs around the same architectural principle. What you do in this life matters in the next one. Not in a simple cause and effect way, not merely as reward and punishment, something more nuanced than that, more interesting, more honest. The Egyptians said, "How you treated others is literally the weight of your heart. Every act of cruelty makes it heavier. Every act of genuine compassion makes it lighter. The scale does not lie. The scale has never lied. You cannot charm it or bribe it or explain your way around it. It weighs what it weighs." The Romans said, "How you honored your obligations to your family, to your dead, to the invisible threads that hold a community together determines whether your spirit rests or wanders. You cannot simply receive love and care in life and give nothing back. The dead are watching, they remember." The Vikings said, "The story of your life is being written right now by every choice you make in the presence of people who will one day be responsible for telling it. Live in a way that gives the skald something true and worthy to say, because the story is all that survives." In Mesopotamia, the oldest, the most unsentimental, the one that looked at death with the least comfort and the most honesty, said simply this: "Everyone ends up in the same place. The king and the slave, the remembered and the forgotten, the great and the ordinary. What matters is not escaping that place. What matters is who walks you to the gate." 4 civilizations, 4 different theologies, 4 sets of gods and rituals and sacred texts. One instruction: be worth knowing, be worth remembering, and know someone well enough that you would walk them to the edge of the world if they needed you to. Here is what strikes me most, now that we have spent this night together in the dark. These people were not waiting for death the way we sometimes imagine ancient people waiting for death, with resignation, with superstition, with their eyes fixed on the sky looking for divine signs. They were living, fully, urgently, with tremendous attention to the texture of each day. Merritt the embalmer woke each morning and walked through streets that smelled of river mud and fresh bread. She did a difficult and sacred job with precision and care. She came home at night and checked her name on a stone tile under the floor, not in despair, but in the same quiet, practical way you might check the lock on the front door before bed. Just making sure. Marcus wrote home from a rainy wall at the edge of the Roman world and asked for warm socks. He worried about his father's comfort in the underworld the same way a good son worries about his aging parents today, from a distance, with guilt, with love, with the helpless tenderness of someone who cannot be in 2 places at once. Astrid recited 47 names in the dark every night, including her sons, especially her sons. She did not do this because her theology required it, although it did. She did it because she was a mother, and mothers do not stop speaking to their children simply because the children have gone somewhere the mother cannot follow. And Ernama, the old scribe in the oldest city in this story, copied the same frightening text over and over again, long past the hour when the rest of the household slept. Not because he was afraid exactly, but because he was the kind of person who believed that understanding a thing, even a terrible thing, even an inevitable thing, was better than looking away from it. He was right. And here is the final hidden truth that all 4 of these civilizations, in their different languages and under their different skis, were pointing toward. The river is not out there. It is not something that happens later at the end when the body gives out and the last breath leaves the room. The river is here. It runs through every ordinary Tuesday, every unfinished conversation, every person you know whose name you carry in your memory like a small warm stone in a coat pocket, their birthday, the sound of their laugh, the particular way they used to tell a story. Every time you speak the name of someone who is gone, you are performing the most ancient ritual in human history. Every time you say, "I remember him, she would have loved this. He taught me that," you are standing at the bank of that river and calling across it. And on the other side, in whatever form it takes, in the duet beneath the Egyptian stars, in the cold halls of hell, in the gray dust of Kir, in the place where Roman shadows rest, something hears you. Something that was waiting. Something that needed to know it had not been forgotten. The scale balances. The ferryman lowers the oar. The crossing holds. You have been doing this your whole life without knowing what it was called. Without knowing that Merritt and Marcus and Astrid and Ernama were doing the same thing, in the same dark, for the same reasons, 4,000 years before you were born. You are part of a chain so long it disappears into the beginning of human memory. And somewhere at the far end of that chain, someone you have not yet met is going to speak your name in the dark. And it is going to matter. More than you know. More than you can possibly imagine tonight. Let that thought rest with you now. Let it settle. The story is nearly complete. The river is very quiet here near the far shore. And the night has grown soft. We have reached the far shore. Rest here for a moment. There is nothing more to solve tonight, nothing more to understand. The questions that brought us here, the ones that have kept human beings awake for 4,000 years, do not need answers tonight. They only needed company, and tonight they had it. Let your body remember that it is lying down, feel the weight of it. The particular heaviness that comes not from exhaustion but from having traveled far, the kind of tiredness that is also quietly a satisfaction. You went somewhere tonight, you came back, that matters. The civilizations we visited tonight are gone. The Egypt of Merit, the embalmer, exists now only in stone and dust, and the things they left behind with such extraordinary care. The Rome of Marcus and his father and the Umbras walking through unlocked houses, its streets are buried beneath modern ones. Its language is dead except in law courts and church Latin, and the roots of words you use every single day without knowing where they came from. The long houses of Astrid's Scandinavia have rotted back into the earth. The fjords remain, the stars she navigated by remain, but her voice, the particular sound of her voice reciting her son's name in the dark, that has been gone for 1,000 years. And Mesopotamia, the first city, the first writing, the first person who pressed a reed into wet clay and decided that words were worth preserving. All of it now is silence. Oh, and yet, here you are, lying in the dark, breathing slowly. Having spent this night in the company of Merritt and Marcus and Astrid and Ernama as if they were old friends, as if the thousands of years between you were nothing more than a long room you had simply walked across. That is what stories do. They collapse time. They reach across every river, every border, every century of silence, and they take your hand and they say, you are not the first person to lie awake in the dark and wonder. You are not the first person to love someone so much that the thought of losing them is unbearable. You are not the first person to hope, quietly and without quite admitting it, that something of you will last. You are the latest person. In a line so long it stretches back to the first fire ever made by human hands. The river the ancients believed in, the one that runs between this world and whatever comes after, I think they were right about it. Not necessarily in the way they described it. Not the literal boat, the literal coin, the literal ferryman waiting in the mist. But the feeling underneath it. The sense that there is a membrane, a soft, thin, permeable place between the living and the dead, between the present and the past, between the person you are right now and all the people who came before you, whose choices and fears and loves and stories eventually, through a long and unlikely chain of events, produced you. That membrane is thinnest at night. When the world is quiet. When you are lying exactly like this. You may have felt it before and not known what to call it. The sudden, unexplained sense that someone you have lost is somehow not as far away as they should be. The way a smell or a piece of music can drop you into a memory so completely that for just a moment the person in that memory feels present, real, close enough to touch. That is the river. That is what 4,000 years of human beings have been describing, in 4,000 different ways, in every language the world has ever made. The distance is real, and it is also somehow not as final as it looks. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the ancient dead rest. Let Merit sleep beside the Nile. Let Marcus put down his pen. Let Astrid's fire burn low. Let Ernama's lamp go out. They did their work. They carried their questions with dignity and with care. They built their tombs and wrote their letters and memorized their names and copied their texts long past midnight, and they crossed their river when it was time, and whatever is on the other side received them. And tonight, in this darkness, in this room, in this particular quiet moment, they were remembered. By you. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Your body is heavy now. Your breath is slower. The ceiling above you is just a sailing. The dark is just dark. Soft and familiar and completely safe. There is nothing waiting in it tonight. Only rest. Only the oldest, simplest gift the living world gives us, this nightly crossing into sleep, this small rehearsal, this gentle reminder that letting go is something the body already knows how to do. You have done it 10,000 times. You will do it again. Right now, let the story settle into you like sediment into still water. Slowly, without effort, the river is quiet. The far shore is peaceful. You are remembered. You are known. You are here. And it is enough. Sleep now.